Forward. Here is the first edition of this book prepared for wide circulation with uncolored artwork courtesy of the insuperable Dane Sell. This book, in its totality, was written in the dark days of November 2020 during a period of prolonged unemployment. I would like to thank my parents for providing me a room to sleep in during that time. In its current state, there are undoubtedly editorial flaws which persist despite consistent efforts. Complaints and suggestions can be addressed, as of this edition, to the Twitter profile at johnbar3568770. The subject matter of this book is generally unpleasant and deals with some of the worst moments of the human experience, which, although better ignored in daily life, should never be forgotten nor minimized. This book is dedicated to you, dear listener. The German soul has a place for the glorification of brute force, for the notion of war as a colossal looting campaign. That is all it holds. It is not much. All her principles are based on one idea, namely, that right and morality are not the same for all, that there are privileged individuals who may deliver themselves from their shackles. It is a wicked theory. It cannot be too strongly opposed. From head to heel, Germany was tainted with this spirit. It assumed the importance of a dogma. The worst means were sanctified by her, if used to this end. Quote from Ferdinand Foch. The missile knows where it is at all times. It knows this because it knows where it isn't. By subtracting where it is from where it isn't, or where it isn't from where it is, whichever is greater, it obtains a difference or deviation. The guidance subsystem uses deviations to generate corrective commands to drive the missile from a position where it is to a position where it isn't, and arriving at a position where it wasn't, it now is. Consequently, the position where it is now the position that it wasn't, and it follows that the position that it was is now the position that it isn't. In the event that the position that it is in is not the position that it wasn't, the system has acquired a variation, the variation being the difference between where the missile is and where it wasn't. If the variation is considered to be a significant factor, it too may be corrected by the GEA. However, the missile must also know where it was. The missile guidance computer scenario works as follows. Because a variation has modified some of the information the missile has obtained, it is not sure just where it is. However, it is sure where it isn't, within reason, and it knows where it was. It now subtracts where it should be from where it wasn't, or vice versa, and by differentiating this from the algebraic sum of where it shouldn't be and where it was, it is able to obtain the deviation and its variation, which is called error. Quotation from the United States Air Force training video. Chapter 1. The Fool. Ashes spilled into his mouth, fine at first, bitter tasting, and then grittier and grittier. He kept his eyes tightly closed, refusing to see, but he could feel the powdery gray waste cover his face and nose, feel its grease and smell, the overpowering smell that could not be there but somehow was. He couldn't seem to shut his mouth as it filled, fuller and fuller, and the bitter taste turned to burning lye. He could feel more than grit in the paste of blood and white ash now, and the painful crunch of what had once been teeth cut into his gums as he choked on the cone of ruin in his throat. The rain continued around him, up to his thighs and elbows, and his tears cut gorges down into the ashen face mask. It was the breathless sensation of aspirating, dead air building in his lungs, fires inside him, no more hope. He broke, and panic forced his eyes open. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, eyes opening into a gray world of pain and burning, flooding with white light. The train bounced a little again, jostling Commodore of Naval Intelligence Josiah Venchler awake. Again, light flooded his eyes. This time he managed to keep them open, slowly adjusting to the great white sun in that clear blue sky, not dimmed by soot or smog like in the cities back home. There must have been some little dents in the rails, shoddy repairs after a bandit raid, maybe back from when there had been real fighting here. The crimson-painted coach was rounding a sharp curve across the river bridge. The rounded silver mirror which shone in the sun was uncreatively called Winding River. Around the distant engine car, already over the bridge, he could see the grains just starting to bulge at the head, pale yellow and green over the rolling fields. The wrought iron bridge, straight, clean lines, well engineered and sturdy, was passing under him now, and the wide arch of the guard was like a doorway whose searchlight's polished lens gleamed in the sun like a brass bell on some great house in the capital. But there was no marble out here, just timber and iron, simple and hard. From the angle of the sun on his face, it must have been starting to push from midday into late afternoon. He gave a foolish smile, welcoming the warm glow. There was already noticeably less light in the sky at this hour than there had been even 2 weeks ago, and some nights already had a hint of the autumn's teeth. But still, there were weeks of sun before the ground would dissolve in the late fall rains and the frost would stalk farms like a wolf. He had only boarded the train that morning, which meant they were making good time as the chained forts come towns were already emerging on the riverside. His pupils narrowed on the shadows of the riverbed, the reeds and trees and the rocks. A family legend said that one of his grandfathers had been a scout in the area when their civilization had first strode forth into what had been a totally wild land. If that was true, that ancestor had been a bigger fool than even Joe. What had he thought he'd find out here? Christmas? There hadn't even been real buildings in those days when the pioneers had crossed frontier bridges, just swarms of angry Reds holding on to their shacks in the muck and the mire. The place had been something else for the red men and savages who lived in the mud and muck of the river in those days, but now it was Fort Schleiper. At least that's what it was called on the rail maps. Fort Fern was his destination, located only half a click away from the titular Schleiper, but on the far side of the town. Schleiper had, at any given time, between 5 and 9 actual forts manned by different groups, cultists, trade companies, competing rail lines, the Navy, the Army, a dozen local militias, and fundamentalists. The stone walls draped with 50 different banners, booming 50 hymns and chants, all shared one thing: the raw concrete faces that stared grimly out to the countryside farms. They made a rough crescent against the southern branch of the river, and most of the tall buildings and market shops, including the station, fell within their cold embrace. Through their stolid visages seemed to betray practicality, they were more like a general, a clown, or high society hat, their pointless walls encrusted with glistening gun ports of chrome and brass, laced with ribbons of red and white, black and gold, every color that could be printed or painted under this territorial sun. As his carriage passed between a couple of the stone beasts, he felt the same chill he always did, which had nothing to do with the now setting sun's red rays. It was the chill of the garrisoned frontier past, which even now scarred this well-civilized and peaceful town. He had to chuckle at such superstitions, associations, nothing more than bad jokes. He was already picturing a hot cup of coffee, steaming, mixing with nicotine vapor, served by a stodgy old station waiter. Just a little pickup for the walk to the fort, past the little town's buildings. Out here, they were still mostly wood and bricks of cream yellow, delicate panes of glass so expensive to move over land, and stunning arches of seal, saved for the new and the rich. In theory, there was still the hazard of the occasional raid from the swamps and the forests where the few unbowed savages haunted, but whatever gunpowder and fire they'd once had was gone, so they posed little real threat to the intimidating fortress walls. A peaceful area in these days, but few passengers on this early fall train heading to the great frontier had ever even entered the territories, and they seemed ill at ease. An elderly man in some faded uniform gripped his armrest tightly with one hand while his other sleeve hung hollow and vacant. One couple was paying too much attention to their gloved hands. A man in a black greatcoat and an immense felt hat kept nervously glancing out at the window, and one matronly woman kept talking to her children in a loud voice that belied any calm conveyed by her prim demeanor. He was a seasoned hand. This wasn't his first tour or even his 50th. Scars and liver spots meant that the back of his left hand was more alien to him now than this great expanse of land, his manifest destiny. He chuckled bitterly. How many destinies had it swallowed whole? Even before he'd served in the territories, he'd grown big exploring the wild forests and hills nearer to home. The train brakes ground to a halt at the platform, sounding its long whistle just as the sun hit the line of tall fort walls. He stood up, shaking the pins out of his legs, stomping his polished boots twice, and then swung his bags over his shoulders. Stepping out into the sunset-drenched cream brick, he found the simple building picturesque, more comfortable for him by far than the choking decadence of engraved marble and kaleidoscopic mix of monumental buildings, frescoes, mosaics, murals, and festival societies found in the capital under that looming shadow of the great marble dome. He remembered a book he had managed to smuggle somehow, which had described some ancient Babylon as a white sepulchre, the kind of decadently rich prose that landed it on a prescription list. The train was far from full, and the passengers reluctant to move onto the hard ground, so there was no rush out of the doors. The station, too, was quiet at this time of day. The night trains to the east wouldn't start running for hours and hours yet, and the westbound trains weren't packed full of people whose luck hadn't panned out at this time of year. Still, there was a low bustle to the station. The few coffee stands with a couple murmuring conversations, new arrivals and townsfolk getting reacquainted over the caffeine-rich steam and whiffs of tobacco. A reflex struck. He patted down his pockets and thighs, checking for his paper, his watch, his wallet, his handgun, and then glancing at the briefcase in his hand to make sure it was there, that it had the bulge of his packages. Patting his head, the pressed hat with his stiff peak and brim, his epaulettes making the ridges under his heavy greatcoat. On this train, out here, in the sleepy town, he cut quite a figure. His boots black shine, his riding pants deep blue, pressed with their red trim, dripping out from the slate-gray greatcoat, above his tan and clean face, up to the white-peaked cap, with its ornaments of midnight leather, silver, and gold. To stand out, so overdressed, invited the tale he must have picked up leaving the capital, and likely would attract more the closer he came to the dark frontier's bloody ground. Discomfort at the pathological paranoia, the fear of a tale, swept him. He stilled his gut, tensing the muscles in his abdomen, and let it pass. Doing so, he felt calmer for it. The weight of his belt, holster hung from it, was as reassuring as anything else, and he felt like a fine king's court jester in his gaudy uniform, graced by the sinking sunlight. He checked his watch, its long gold hands marking second after second. It read 4:30, which gave him an hour before he would be expected at Fern. As much out of courtesy to the tale as to indulge himself, he went to pull up a seat at one of the cafes. He thumbed through the table menu, signaled the staff that he'd take a dark coffee and a fresh pipe bowl. An old man, also one-armed and gray-haired, obliged after a moment and brought him over the local blends, the coffee, a bit stale, and the pipe, flavored with lemon. The obsession out here for lemon was something else. He knew that out on the distant northern frontier, the citrus was worth their weight in gold, but even further south, where they grew on trees, they were prized for the color and size. Once he detached the bowl, however, the hot citrus fumes and the strong drink shocked his brain back to tech. He could feel his blood coursing hard in his arteries against his tight collar, a good, reliable reminder that he was alive. No cruel king or angry Norn had cut the thread of his fate, yet. Perhaps he was being kept alive for some cruel joke, perhaps simply to enjoy the delicious coffee and heady vapor. His eyes tracked across the station to the other stands with their specialty pastries and soups, searching and investigating the personages who peopled the station. They said that doppelganger symbolized death. Old Skull and Bones, with his scythe and hood, would send them to you beforehand as a sign. An omen, maybe, or simply a mirror, your face concealing death beneath it, the laughing skull which would emerge from ruddy flesh. Somehow he felt as if he was some kind of doppelganger for his whole country. Looks that were somehow bland and unimposing, unnoticeable, perfectly average, but animated with a spark that all the wall paintings of the old world and all the great portraits of historic generals and leaders tried to capture. Call it navel gazing, call it vainglory, but there was always a tick of disgust from seeing other people with no feature to distinguish them. A homogenized, unified state of being, it could be called. Of course, down south there was quite a difference of people and pages of reminiscences of the warm beaches and ripe figs. But here in this station, he expected familiarity, the same builds and heights and shaves and hairlines he had grown up with, that he had only just gotten off the train with, the same that he saw in the mirror every morning. A foolish fancy, but death at every corner, tales and agents and plots behind every desk in the capital. It was fit for a nation made of doppelgangers. Perhaps that was why the slim man in the black coat, who had followed him off the carriage, who had sat down simultaneously across the tracks from him, and was now staring at an apple tart, was so shocking. Not the presence, but the utter lack of a doppelganger. The man had the same cut of coat, the same comically oversized hat, and the same elongated frame as he had worn before on the train. Yet he swore the man on the train had been an easy peg for a business dandy or a political snake, close-set eyes, a thin nose, and a city dweller's sour, clean face that had twitched under the expanse of sky. The figure across the tracks from him, however, was different. Under the huge felt hat, there was a great forking black beard, and angry-looking eyebrows that jutted from his face in great peaks. The face was heavy-set, dripping with fat, but above a fit frame, characteristic of frontier flesh, melted by years of heavy drinking and icy wind. He swept the rest of the station, the waiting areas outside the glass doors, even glancing at the train windows. No sign of anyone he could have missed. And the hat, it had to be the same. He sucked in another lungful of citrus vapors. It was possible, very likely even this was a trick of his mind. There had been 2 men on the train. He had missed the exit of a clean-shaven chap. Or maybe one had stolen the other's hat and left without a fuss. The improbability of the antique hat, though, made him uneasy. Another puff, another suck. Could he be misremembering the face from the train? Could it have gotten jumbled with a different face? Swapped a silly city dweller for the frontier race? Used to the uniformity of faces in the capital after too many recent months of desk work and boozing? This, in fact, was very disturbing. If his memory was starting to give out, another exhale, another inhale. The orange light in the bowl was dimming, giving out. Perhaps it was a tail, some personnel tracker from the capital, sent to smoke out whatever the Navy, or perhaps a rogue officer, was doing here. The risks of taking 3 months of excursion to get to his new post. Could it be the man was a master of disguise who had swapped faces? Oh, the face had changed, but the outfit was left intact and distinctive. His lungs deflated, longing for the warm buzz of the pipe. If it was a devilish tale, it was best ignored for the moment. If it wasn't, if it was less an omen than a symptom, it was best ignored too. Let a vacation to the frontier unkink the mind. So he told himself, it was just chance. 2 felt hats of the same make. Nothing against the white porcelain vanishing into the mosaic smear of grounds. Nothing more to it. Repeat that 10 times. Start to fake belief. He downed the coffee dregs, black against the white porcelain, vanishing into the mosaic smear of grounds, and got up to leave. What did they put in the tobacco here, hidden by that lemon burst? Another dangerous line of thoughts. The only people who could have wanted him had to be, he told himself over and over, much weaker than his imagination led him to fear. Be reasonable, and we'll get out of this, he thought. 7 till 5 by his ticking mechanical heart. Time to take a walk to the riverside. An etched brass plate hanging from iron bars announced that Fort Fern was the furthest inland naval fort in the territories. It had indeed been that for about 2 years. As the wise men who ran the Navy soon found, transport costs had increased as the frontier grew, and the volume of wheat and tobacco, cotton, wood, and iron, and anything else that was worth thinking about, and some things that were best left unthought, had skyrocketed. Forts had sprung up along the rivers. Like rich veins under bare skin, they stretched, arteries on maps and across fields. But such beautiful and precious things, the Navy had sagely concluded, could not be left freely open. The red savages still made the occasional gesture of resistance, and of course there were the more civilized breeds of bandits and political bushwhackers. And someone had to make sure the flots of lumber and the barges of iron kept moving. That was how fools like him were sent on errand sojourns to these distant lands, and ones more distant yet, hinc sunt dracones. Patrol boats, chariots for such fools as him, ballasted with cannons and marines, were stationed along these vital waterways. Wherever they docked, the high command made sure to build a hard place, uncomfortable to sleep in and ugly to look at. Being the first far inland fort to be built, when the Navy wasn't as learned in the ways of ugly construction, Fern was almost shapely, although no sane man would have called the old lady's squat configuration beautiful. The old gun barrels that pointed ominously down the river towards bandit-ridden swamps had been gathering rust by now, or would have if the neurotic men on duty hadn't spent 60 years obsessively polishing them at all hours. This wasn't surprising. Despite the name, this fort was a posting that blue water men kept for themselves, and unlike the landlubber Marines, the ship's captains mostly came from the old inbred stock of the Northeast, just like he did. Arriving at the stockade gate, black iron set against hard stone walls, he waved to the gate sergeant, then whistled, then stomped and kicked the gate, swearing, before finally yelling out that he was looking for Commodore Arnie Vorsaski. The unfortunately named Commodore came from a family of Volga Deutsch. A more savory family might have invented a better name, free of Russian butchered consonants, but dumb Slavic obstinacy, or German pride, had stuck with them, depending on how you felt about their family, and resulted in Vorsaski's grandfather drunkenly slurring out something the RNS Immigration Office took at face value. At last, the old coot had bought himself and his brothers naval commissions when they had arrived in the country. Along with the commissions, the strange name and the strong accent stuck with Vorsaski's old man and had been passed down to him. No one was really sure how the name was said, and perhaps all the Vorsaskis changed it routinely, just to throw off anyone who was starting to catch up. He had met Arnie in the Naval Academy, training on a sloop as old as time itself, where they had made fast friends mucking up the rigging. The private part of private correspondence didn't mean so much these days, and never had for officers in the armed forces, and they didn't write to each other often. But they always got back together by drinking, as if somebody had died, and sometimes, in fact, because someone had died. There was no longer a fear of a binge interrupting a memorized sequence of coordinates or navigating flag rules, but now they had to be wary of the rocky shoals of hangovers and age. After a good minute and a half of increasingly painful kicks, the gate swung stiffly open, and a sergeant stepped out to salute him. Upon returning to the salute with what was a sycophantic grin or a homicidal glare, the unflappable gate guard mentioned that Commander Vorsaski was overseeing a march at the barracks. When he pressed the sergeant, he got nothing more than a placid smile and a repetition. The man was probably hitting an opium pipe between shifts in this snooze of a town. Somewhat annoyed at the pain in his boot, he passed through the gatehouse towards the heart of Fern. In all, 4 acres were enclosed by its walls, offering plenty of sheltered space. The armory and barracks buildings were clear enough, located square in the middle of the rectangular lawn. From there, the walls stretched horizontally out, making a fortified strip along the river twice as long as it was wide, and rather sensually flowing with the riverbeds. Entering from the town gate, the far wall had a long building up against it where the small river boats could enter, fuel, and be stored in the cold winters. Neat gravel paths connected everything in plain sight, in straight lines and right angles. Green grass was predominant, complemented by juniper hedges in their jade rows, ideal demarcations for a ball field. Another series of long and low brick buildings were almost camouflaged against the far wall. Beyond them, his destination towered into the sky, rising above the walls. A survey and fire tower rose in a steeple above the congregated soldiers who crowded around the base of the Commodore's quarters with jeers and raised fists. On the stairway of the tower, a small table was set up. Like a preacher at his pulpit, Vorsaski was leading the troops in jeering chants. Not wanting to disturb the mystifying proceedings, he kept his profile low, hunkering around the back of the crowd. Young men, close-cut haircuts, short blonde beards, beer bellies, naked muscles bulging in the crowd, and the energy of mob violence, organized into spectacle, struck him like the must of the rivermen's sweat. A cage of iron bars and timber planks joined the spire and the roof of Arnie's reinforced lodging, and inside the strange cage he saw two shirtless young men, same dirty blonde, crew-cut faces as the crowd, muscles gleaming with blood and sweat, rippling with every gyrating thrust of a fist. The young men were going at each other, man gegen man, mano a mano, with cloth-wrapped fists forced in close by the jagged cold metal and splintered wood of the tower. At another time, such blood sport and lax security proceedings would have been a serious problem, but after months of pushing paper for some bureaucratic weevils, he felt himself caught up in the raucous air, the smell of the blood, and the masculine fight. To see men in the capital play at this would have been perverse, but here in the restorative hardship of a rural expanse, the authentic fort town, even as tame as it was in these days, well, he could feel his skin itch with excitement, memories of his own more violent and foolhardy youth. Pulling his briefcase and sack over his back, he leapt up into the flat brick roof of Arnie's home and quickly scaled the rough cage of the tower. His arms felt the bite of the climb with eagerness, matched only by his wide smile as he swung onto the tower platform, offering a part of the precious briefcase's contents, an amber-brown bottle of cognac, to the startled Arnie. Arnie looked up, smiling at first. Then he turned red, dark as the brandy, with chunks of spittle streaking through his great gray mustache. "What the fuck do you think you're doing here, you rat bastard?" He gestured out to the suddenly silent crowd. Only the grunts and slams of the fighting men below remained. "What goddamn moron of a soldier invited one of the four-eyed pricks from intelligence out here?" he added with a voice of menacing threat. "I'll confiscate their rum ration for a month and hand it out to the crowd tonight. Inform!" Suddenly, a high-pitched voice from a boyish lieutenant in the back of the crowd thundered out, "Sir, it was you, or sir?" Vorsaski made an exaggerated gesture of comic relief, slapping his forehead and stumbling backwards as if in shock. "I should flay you alive for informing on a brother officer, sir," he yelled at the lieutenant, but then gestured. "Just bring the men my rum ration, eh? Fitting punishment." The men loudly cheered. Now Arnie gestured back down to the cage. "Don't stop on my account. No rest for the wicked. 50 silver eagles that Jonas goes down inside a minute." And he tossed some cash over the cage towards the crowd. Rhythmic chanting from the men soon laid itself out over the constant pounding flows of the fight beneath. He took a seat and poured out the brandy into the tall glass that had been hiding in his bag. "Well, Arnie, you dipshit," he began jokingly, "you can drink my brandy for now, but when we run out, will you turn for relief with no rum to comfort you?" As he was pouring Arnie's glass full, his friend laughed. "I gave up my rum ration, but I've still got my Magdas." And with his introduction to an unfamiliar name, he tapped his nose slyly. Jonas, it turned out, did not go down in under a minute, and the 3-minute bell rang shortly after, indicating there'd be at least another round of the slugfest. Neither he nor Arnie could actually watch the fight from the platform above the cage, But Arnie insisted it was better to watch the crowd of men in the graying dusk. The unfortunate lieutenant, another Rosaski apparently, a cousin, handed out the rum ration, and the men below broke into little groups to discuss and drink before the fight resumed. For all the military pomp, this was more of a crowd than a mob. He could see all that. The 30-minute nautical light warning bell was clanging, hard metal bells all over the fort, and the poor sentries on night shift were checking the torches and lights all along the great dark walls that loomed in the distant half-light. He could hear the fighters below, gearing up to resume, pumping themselves as the base cook brought over big wooden bowls of steaming food, taking a safer wooden staircase up the tower. The plate set in front of him was full to the brim with the thick, hot stew. Arnie gestured at it. Local buffalo. They're overrunning the South Bank these days. Meant to work with the burnings to clear out the bogs and the woods for us, make the inhospitable ground into a garden. Pipe dreams, of course, but they're savory pipe dreams. Arnie downed the glass of brandy and gestured for another. How have you been? Was the train out here fine? Was the... Whatever was it that you wanted to discuss? You said you had something for me. The onslaught of questions made him feel unsteady, so he drained his own glass and poured out more. It was rich and fiery as it flew down his gullet, and too filling in the early fall heat for the thick meat soup with big hunks of purple muscle to be appealing. You know, he said. How was he ever doing in this goddamn land, surrounded by sycophants and sinners of the worst variety? The train was fine, ran at a reasonable rate. The new freight lines get the job done. He didn't mention the man, or men, in the felt hat and tried to brighten his face, wash the hollowness out of his sunken eyes, make some sort of jest. I'll show you what I have later, when we get somewhere a little more private, you know. Arnie nodded, and then to cut the tension which was mounting around the brandy and the heady night, You show me yours, I'll show you mine. Arnie did not laugh. Like the crown of numbers on a watch face, the planets were out. Jupiter, already high in the sky, gleaming bright like a fine diamond. Just above the western wall of the fort, Mars flashed hints of ruby light in the moonless purple of the horizon. Below them, the agitated shouts of the men turned to cheers. Jonas, whoever, someone, went down hard, and the crowd went wild. Arnie bit his lip. And how are you, Versaski? The fort not bringing you down too much? That's fine. Easy. No fucking rebs looking to bushwhack you. Only the odd escaped slave with a pistol or swamp savage. Easy work for the picket boats. It's almost like it isn't work. Driving up and down the rivers. Beer on ice. If you got the time, I'll take you out. The other Rosaski, the lieutenant, brought up the winner. Torchlight danced over his skin, shimmering gold and crimson on beads of sweat and blood. Above the powerful muscles of the man's head and neck, his young face hung, a swollen lip and an eye bruised and already blackening. Arnie feted him briefly before the men, and Joe offered a glass of brandy. He and Arnie were staring at their fifth glasses, sparkling like amber necklaces in the light of the torches on the watchtower. This is good stuff, Joe. Where'd you find it? Is this typical city egghead's private French booze stash, huh? They both chuckled. If you brought any more, I'd like to take a bottle back to my Magda. He trailed off. Joe knew it was expected. Yes, tell me about this Magda. What pretty creature do you have wrapped around your gold braid now, Mr. Commodore? Trying to lilt his voice enough for the desired effect, but no more. His face felt a little numb from the booze already. It was going up fast. He poured more brandy into his mouth and swushed it around. He stood himself up to try to stretch his legs, and everything felt a little swirly. Arnie sipped at his glass like a reluctant schoolboy. Or do you really have feelings for her, eh? He knew now what was up, and he'd have to coax Arnie for details. It's good to be out here, though. I've had a real stick-up-my-ass around this promotion. Around life generally. It's good to be moving again. Arnie was staring at his glass. Inside the square bottle, the brown liquor swashed around the bottom third, and a sense of Academy Days deja vu trickled over the back of his skull, running into his scratched, tired eyes. His eyes blinked open. The sun peered over the prow of the riverboat, where he and Versaski stretched out, resting his head on the briefcase and tilting his cap so that it covered his eyes. Under the protective gaze of the Marine in the gun tower, the whole town could be glimpsed, fading into the background which filled in the docks and the rail bridge with reeds and weeping willow trees. The other forts, squat without comparable command towers, were well out of sight when they started talking. Out here, there was little chance of an interlocutor overhearing anything, although he fancied that a man in a black suit and a black round hat was trying to follow at a distance along the far shore. These days, almost nowhere was safe from the ears of the political machines or some tight-ass security staff man, but a Navy boat was a little floating island of privacy, guaranteed by Arnie's own command. Still, Joe noticed that Arnie kept his eyes peeled and spoke in quiet tones, merging with the rush of the water under the boat. Two paranoids in a pear tree, feathers falling out. Well, that was unfair to himself. Despite the appellation Egghead, only Arnie was balding. Reeds and rocks lined the banks as the little boat drifted towards the marshland area. It's mostly safe here. More ghosts than actual Reds left these days. And adding a gesture to dismiss a man from the gun tower. He left them alone with their cold lager on the deck in the sunlight. Even to Arnie, he felt uncomfortable mentioning the idea of the tale, feeling an icy grip in his nauseous stomach that no beer could soothe at the thought of being labeled T4 unfit. There was no going back from something like that, and the fear of that hand stretching out from the Capitol, plucking him, fingers starched and bound in black silk. He loved Arnie like a brother, but it was fear that slid across his sun-warmed skin like a slick of ice. One message of well-intentioned concern might be enough to get those gears turning. So the big city, out on the edge of civilization. Lots of indigenes there, I hear. Merchants and drovers who couldn't get a berth back here, Versaski said, sliding a bottle of beer into his gullet and cracking open another. Lindemann, you remember Lindemann? And Joe did, a sort of distant protege, very masculine, always working out, and there was something else. Yeah, Lindemann, right? You trained him. He remembered Lindemann now, Gregor. He would have to message him, but they had moments, more than moments. That's the one. Moved out there where the meat's a little redder. Anyway, Arnie paused to lick the beads of froth and sweat from the cold beer bottle. He's in the service. Reliable if you can get to him. Joe demurred. I'll keep that in mind. He was trying not to think too much about what he was actually trying to do. Speaking of the big city, now Joe glanced around furtively. My old friend, I brought you something. Underneath its polished brown leather and bright brass claps, his briefcase contained a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He gently undid it, slipped out a black square bulk, and handed it to Arnie. You recognize this? Arnie lifted one of his bushy gray eyebrows. What? This old thing? My gramps told me they'd huddle around this back during the war. That's what this is, right? More or less. Joe paused. I can't keep doing this shit, Arnie. Arnie looked into his eyes, a strange and intimate pause. They knew each other then. Sorting through the old files and pay books from the stuff with drovers, he swallowed, his dry throat catching itself. We were doing riverboat training out east, right after the Civil. Well, you remember. Arnie nodded. Sure. Joe paused again. We were supposed to be hunting some real Comanche types, horse thieves, bandits, real Mongol Huns. Arnie nodded thoughtfully. Right. Making the rivers unsafe with their raiding. I remember. Then there's that nasty business with the illegal squatters, right? Trying to farm that fucking desert. Bad times. Joe felt a tear in his soul rising up to his eyes, welling pain. He pushed it down. Hard times. You remember how they had us give out some stuff? Pig lard or whatever to calm everyone down. What's the point here? Orsasky demanded. You just need a woman. Magda, she lost her husband to the frontier. Lots of women like that in these parts. Maybe you might find one for yourself. It'd do you good. It's made me feel like a real part of society, a real ground outside this shit. And he gestured back down the river at the fort. Joe faked a laugh, hoping it was convincing. He knew what they'd done, things that would follow them until death and beyond. No patchy clown suit or warm bed at night would be free of them. Didn't they haunt Arnie? Tension coiled within him, mortal agony at the immortal stain. He couldn't speak it, not even to Arnie. I don't know. I just feel old and tired. Tired of the border wars and the slave fights. Tired of the trains and the shitty timetables always moving forward erratically like a broken watch. Tired of my memories. He added, dripping with pain and bitterness. He crushed his emotions like a boot heel landing on the head of a snake. Just wanted to catch up with everyone from back in the day, back when we thought we could make a difference in this country. Hand these out so we can stay in touch. So I can get you to jump when I do, he thought. But if the man had a woman, had a life outside this. Pass me another beer, Versasky, he said. They clinked the dark brown glass together, downing it.